In the war-ravaged skies over Europe and the Pacific, the sight and sound of Spitfires and Mustangs was not uncommon. These and many other lightweight but deadly aircraft routinely conquered the enemy and won dominance of the air. These veteran aircraft had been designed to be small and maneuverable. But as the war raged on, an infusion of strength and durability was needed. An altogether different variety of aircraft took to the skies, bigger, heavier, and more powerful, a machine that could perform with the same speed and maneuverability as a Spitfire, yet remain active even after sustaining serious damage. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was appropriately named. Built around a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine, it was essentially a Titan on wings. Its designer, Alexander Kartveli, chief engineer at the Republic Aviation Corporation, knew that good performance could only be achieved by the use of the most powerful radial engine around. Pratt & Whitney's R2800 double wasp 18-cylinder radial provided the necessary power. With power in mind, Kartveli included a turbo supercharger under the rear fuselage. The four-bladed propeller required a diameter of 12 feet 2 inches, which in turn necessitated longer landing gear and guns positioned further outboard. The P-47 was the outcome of a long process of evolution, which began with early Seversky designs in 1933. Seversky himself flew the prototype that led to the P-45 in 1935. By late 1939, a further design was ordered as the XP-47. But combat reports from Europe indicated that more guns and more horsepower were needed. That's when Kartveli stepped in. The prototype XP-47B first flew on the 6th of May 1941. After conquering more than the usual run of development problems, the production model P-47B flew in March 1942. Jackie Cochran was one of Alexander Seversky's winning pilots, and after the Seversky Aircraft Corporation was renamed as Republic, Cochrane continued to fly their planes. In 1937, when most Army pursuit planes could barely reach 200 miles per hour, Cochrane broke the record with a speed of 304 miles per hour at the National Air Show. With Jackie Cochran constantly winning trophies for the Seversky Corporation, the company had become well known. Seversky himself had been participating in the races, but after an accident, he ceased involvement in the competition. A modification was made to the design, moving the engine forward 8 inches to improve stability. This minor development resulted in the designation P-47C. By early 1943, production moved on to the P-47D with a refined engine, turbo and intercooler installation, more armor, increased ammunition and weapon loads, and a bubble canopy. Further developments extended the dorsal fin. By this time, production was increasing rapidly. There were now 3 production plants introducing P-47s, the parent plant at Farmingdale, a new factory at Evansville, Indiana, and the Curtiss Wright Company, whose aircraft were designated P-47G. Although the P-47 designers thought of everything, occasional equipment failures sometimes led to some unusual flying techniques. If the landing gear got a bit sticky on approach, the pilots often employed the practical and efficient wing wiggle maneuver. As the popularity and success of the P-47 continued, so did the additional designs. During the production of the P-47's D series, improvements included a universal wing able to carry fuel tanks, bombs or rockets, a stronger belly attachment for heavier tanks and bombs, and broad paddle blade propellers. In total, there were 12,602 of these models produced, which is more than any other aircraft subtype. The Luftwaffe was causing considerable damage in Europe at around the time P-47s entered the game. The versatile and deadly Thunderbolts were shipped to Europe in vast numbers. As in all the combat theaters, the success of the P-47s and their pilots was quickly established. The savage and relentless battles that were waged against the Allies by the Luftwaffe were soon to be faced with equal force by the powerful and efficient Thunderbolts. The tide of evil that was sweeping through Europe had been met. The first operational sortie over France was flown on the 8th of April 1943. Though aircraft losses and mechanical failures still occurred, the pilots of the P-47s had adjusted to their toughness, speed, and firepower. Using the continuing development of the fuel tanks, the pilots were able to take full advantage of their planes' increasing range, and over time, tactics were developed to exploit their overall speed advantage. The first tasks of the P-47 were high-altitude escort duties and fighter sweeps. The pilots soon learned that they could outdive any Luftwaffe or Allied fighter, which gave them a decisive method for breaking off combat when necessary. At the time of the Thunderbolt's European debut, radial-engine single-seat fighters were a rarity. The only other such fighter operational in Europe was the German FW-190A. To prevent confusion during combat, the engine cowlings of the Thunderbolts were painted white, and black bands were painted around the vertical and horizontal tail surfaces. The signal is given for a squadron of Thunderbolts to race for the skies. What would in peacetime appear to be a friendly race has altogether different connotations for these pilots. There's a war raging in the skies over Germany, and these P-47s are in a hurry to join the battle. Flying in formation, they head towards a fight that could cost them their lives, and that thought is always present in their minds. But these men have a job to do, and they have colleagues out there who need their help. The newly arrived Thunderbolts join a fearsome battle with the Luftwaffe. At this point in the war, the German planes had already suffered heavy losses at the hands of the British Spitfires and Hurricanes. Now the Americans had joined the battle, and the German losses both of planes and pilots were becoming unacceptable. The ferocity of their attacks continued, but their success was declining rapidly, and now not only could they not maintain dominance of the Allied skies, but they could no longer control the skies over Germany itself. The Allies were throwing everything they had at Germany, and a lot of that damage was delivered by the B-17. Naturally, the Luftwaffe weren't far from the B-17s as they delivered their deadly arsenal of bombs, and these bulky, ponderous planes were easy targets. Arriving just in time, the Thunderbolts quickly move in to assist the B-17s and offer protection against the German onslaught. Although the flying fortresses are adequately armed, they can't outmaneuver the faster Luftwaffe Heikels, and in order to carry out their mission successfully, they rely heavily on the air support offered by the Thunderbolts. While the war raged in Europe, troops in the Pacific were engaged against the Japanese. In order to fly air assaults against Japan, the Allies invaded the islands of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, whose proximity to Japan made them desirable places to build airfields. The heavy bombers that flew against Japan needed runways, and after capturing the islands, Allied engineers set to work building vast air bases. The escort duties of the P-47 Thunderbolt included supporting the bombers flying from these islands, and large numbers of P-47s were assigned to carriers in the Pacific. Although the Thunderbolts had not been designed for carrier use, they functioned well enough. There was never any intention of landing them back on board, so they were not equipped with landing hooks. In the absence of a runway, the P-47s were loaded onto catapults and literally fired off the side. With their power, it wasn't hard for them to stay in the air. By the development of the P-47D, their engines had up to 2,800 horsepower and could fly at speeds of up to 433 miles per hour. Later models could hit 467 miles per hour. Once airborne, they had a range of between 1,250 miles and 2,350 miles, depending on the fuel tanks being carried. All models had a service ceiling of 42,000 feet. After landing, the Thunderbolts didn't wait long for action. In preparation for combat, the ground crews ensured that each plane had a full stock of ammunition. As with most of the plane's layout, the armament installation was practical, strongly constructed, and simple to access and service. The Thunderbolt's increasingly deadly external weapons were also easy to load. The rocket installations had at first been poorly designed, and there had been flaws in their accuracy. But these problems had been quickly overcome. The P-47 was equipped with 8 0.5-inch Browning M53 machine guns, with 267 rounds per gun. Later models increased that to 425 rounds per gun. The bomb load was 2,500 pounds, but later models carried 3,000 pounds of bombs and 10 5-inch rockets. In footage recorded by the Thunderbolt's test engineers, the hundreds of spent shells can clearly be seen pouring from beneath the wings. Needless to say, the Thunderbolt was a formidable machine that could spit bullets at the enemy with relentless and deadly accuracy. In Saipan, the P-47s became the first planes to use a new weapon in combat, napalm. Using external fuel tanks as containers, the napalm bombs were constructed on site. A mixture of napalm and gasoline was pumped into the tanks, and a detonator was fitted. The Thunderbolts were an important factor in the Saipan campaign and the campaign on Guam and Tinian. The fighting on Saipan went on into the first weeks of July 1944, with P-47s making many of the short journeys from the airfield to the battlefield and back, offering close support to the ground troops. Though the Japanese soldiers engaged in Tinian fought hard with everything they had little hope of success. The Thunderbolts had completely taken possession of the air, and with little resistance were free to do as they pleased as they attacked the fatigued garrison. With the strength of numbers and firepower behind them, the P-47s efficiently dispatched the enemy in a combined assault. When the Thunderbolt pilots released their arsenal of napalm on the Japanese host, a victory was assured. The P-47's involvement in the Pacific theater was devastating to the enemy, but elsewhere in the world, they were involved in an exclusive and vital operation. Here, in a seemingly insignificant region of Italy, the P-47 Thunderbolt was to earn a secure place in history. On the sleepy Italian island of Corsica, the lives of the peaceful islanders had been disrupted by Italy's involvement in the war. Dawn. The men of the 57th Fighter Group rise with the sun. It's their island now. They prepare for their day with the routine to which they've become accustomed. It has the comfort of the familiar for these men who have made Corsica their home. At a leisurely pace, they move through the early morning's preparation for the inevitable fighting ahead. Today, for these men, will be just like yesterday, and probably just like tomorrow. Lieutenant Colonel Gil Wyman has made his home in the deserted trailer of an Italian general. He's the boss of his squadron at the age of 24. He used to live in Louisville, Kentucky, but his new home is comfortable and it has all the modern conveniences. The American residents of Corsica share their home with the French. Although conversation is limited, they get along okay. They each lost a man yesterday, so the flags are at half-mast. Just a small reminder that pleasant as the surroundings are, these men are still stationed on an active Allied airbase, and the dangers are still very real. 57th Fighter Group are based on Alto Air Base. There are 3 squadrons based here. The steel mat runway stretches 150 by 6,000 feet. The tower call sign is Breakneck. This is Group Commander Lieutenant Colonel Archie J. Knight. 65 Squadron arrive for their briefing. It's formal, short, and to the point. The men sit on a bomb crate and receive their escape kit. This includes enemy money and instructions to get back through the lines. The men are told about their target. Along the narrowest and most mountainous part of southern Italy's peninsula lies the Gustav Line. The Allied troops have been stopped in their tracks just behind it. The air planners want to make use of their Thunderbolts to attack behind the enemy line, weakening the German position. They can best do this by cutting off Germany's supply of troops, fuel, shells, and food traveling south. The plan is called Operation Strangle. Italy is laced with an intricate system of railways. They are one of Germany's main tools in the transport of supplies across Italy. The planners of Operation Strangle intend to rip that tool from the enemy's hands. The 65 Squadron taxi to the dispersal point at the end of the runway. Their mission is clear. They are fully armed, fully fueled, and eager to get started. Some of these men won't make it back, but there are lots of them, and each man fully intends to inflict as much damage to the enemy supply chain as he can. The crew chiefs lovingly prepare each plane for the mission. For obvious reasons, the pilots must have clear visibility, and cleaning the canopy of these planes requires little time or effort, but could save a man's life. A thorough examination of each section of the plane reduces the risk of systems malfunctioning during combat, and again, the crew chiefs leave nothing to chance. For the pilots, no matter what rank, what counts now is how much combat flying they've done. Unless they've done plenty, they're classed as a beginner. They're called sprogs. They remain a sprog until they put a few missions behind them. After they learned a few tricks, they're called a sport. After they've seen a lot of action and been on at least 50 or 60 missions and survived, they're promoted to old sport. The top pilots, like Gil Wyman, are known as wheels. No one knows exactly why. The wheels are identified by a telltale design on the tail of their plane. Major Richard Hunzinger of Tucson, Arizona takes his seat. He's flown 179 missions. The crew chief can't go along, but the pilot fills him in on the mission anyway. It's nothing new. Over the time that these men have been stationed together, they've become friends, and a bit of conversation before the mission helps settle their nerves. The pilots are all set to go, but they don't. They wait. For 5 minutes, these men are given the opportunity to gather their thoughts. It's been planned this way. Any thinking that needs to be done can be done now, on the ground. As soon as these men get airborne, they'll be relying on instincts and reflexes that could be slowed down by a brooding mind. Any thoughts these men have of their homes or their loved ones will have been well thought out by the time they take to the skies, and they'll fly better because of it. Here, hold this till I get back. Takeoff is always rough. The Thunderbolt's a heavy aircraft. A fully loaded P-47D weighs in at 15,000 pounds to 17,500 pounds. A mile of steel runway lies ahead. As the squadron reach the tower, about halfway down, they're committed. They can't hope to stop the plane before it reaches the end. The first pair take off, Wyman and Gustafsson. The second pair taxis out, Goss and Burgess. Next out are Vandor and Richardson. Smith and Atwood. Hickok and Morrow. Last pair, Elwood and Hutzinger. The squadron is airborne. They fly over Corsica, then out to sea. Italy is only 60 miles east. After 60 miles, they're 150 miles behind the German front. The squadron heads north from the castle into the mountains. Leader section, red section, black section. The pilots get into formation, mirroring the squadron leader. He navigates. When he turns, they turn. Wingtip to wingtip. When he climbs, they climb. Always in tight formation. The Thunderbolts are carrying onboard cameras to catch the action on film. One behind the pilot looking forward and back. Under the wing. Inside the wing. Timed with the guns. In the wheel well. In the instrument panel, photographing the pilot himself. The squadron moves into a loose string formation, one plane behind the other. The leader pulls off. The rest of the section follows at 2-second intervals. There's no bomb sight on the P-47. The pilot relies on his skill alone to deliver a bomb to the target. He heads for the bomb blasts from the planes ahead. They've already taken out a bridge. Leader section reforms overhead. Red section moves in. A miss. Another miss. A hit. Black section moves in. Blanket fire over the target scores another hit. The squadron has run out of bombs, but they still have plenty of fuel and ammunition. They ease down to the deck in search of the next target. They find the railway tracks used for transporting troops, food, shells and fuel. Destroying the enemy's supply line is essential. They move in. Following the rivers, the pilots of the P-47 will destroy every rail bridge they find, making it impossible for the Germans to get their supplies through to the south, at least by train. After following the tracks to the inevitable train, the Thunderbolt squadron attacks. They aim for the engine first. That'll stop it moving and provide an easier target. Next, they obliterate the boxcars. There are likely to be supplies inside. The explosions indicate that they contained ammunition. The enemy can't use those shells now. With all southbound rail lines out of commission, the Germans would take to the roads, and so would the attacking Thunderbolts. One of the Thunderbolts has been shot down. There's little point in fighting the blaze. The pilot's already dead. In situations like this, there's nothing that can be done, and the crews on the ground are forced to watch helplessly. Many unfortunate pilots have lost their lives fighting for their country, and many more will die before the war is won. Most of the squadron is alive and unharmed. They took out some supply trains and are now targeting enemy buildings. There are no civilians in these buildings. The military vehicles parked outside attest to that. An explosion confirms that this building was a storage depot for shells, bombs, and other weapons. The squadron returns home. History has shown that in the field of military aviation, there has never been an aircraft that could match the P-47 for ruggedness and dependability. The pilots who flew it into combat called it the Unbreakable and described it as the plane that can do anything. It was also known as the Jug because of its shape, though some people mistakenly believed it to be an abbreviation of Juggernaut. P-47s often returned from their missions full of holes with their wings and control surfaces in tatters. On one occasion, a Thunderbolt pilot, Lieutenant Chestwood, hit a steel pole after attacking a train over occupied France. The collision sliced 4 feet off one of his wings. yet he was still able to fly back safely to England. The involvement of the P-47s in Operation Strangle resulted in the complete destruction of the German and Italian supply lines. The whole operation seriously crippled the Nazis' fighting ability and secured the Thunderbolt's place in history as an invaluable addition to the Allies' air power. As the war raged on and the P-47s continued their relentless attack on the German positions, the design modifications to the Thunderbolt continued. A number of P-47Ds were supplied to the USSR and also to such allies as Brazil and Mexico. The next two variants after the Series D model were largely experimental and comprised the XP-47E and the XP-47F. The XP-47E designation was applied to the last P-47B airframe that was completed in 1943 with the addition of a pressurized cockpit. The XP-47F designation was applied to a single P-47B that was converted for trials with a laminar flow wing. The last version of the Thunderbolt to be built was the P-47N, which was the largest and heaviest of all Thunderbolt variations. It was designed for operations in the Pacific Theater, with particular emphasis on the maximum possible range. Most of the missions flown from Corsica involved the P-47D, which served as the general purpose variant in most of the European theaters, including Corsica. For the pilots and crews of the Alto Air Base at Corsica, the war dragged on. They continued their missions over Italy and inflicted mass destruction as required. Many of the men used their leisure time to write letters to their friends and family back home. Others escaped into the fantasy of books and magazines. But these distractions couldn't wipe away the horror of war. Whilst floating aimlessly on the waves with a canine colleague, or sleeping the horrors away, the grim face of the enemy was ever present in the minds of those brave men. In many ways, the adrenaline-soaked airborne conflicts were the best distraction these men had. There was no time to miss their homes or their loved ones during battle. Every aspect of the pilot's awareness was focused and alert. And attacking the Luftwaffe airfields provided the pilots with an opportunity to exercise their skills to the fullest. After taking out their targets, the pilots peel up to reduce their speed and space their planes 20 seconds apart for landing. Then they lower their landing gear and make their approach. The second flight peels up, the next flight will circle again. This is all the flying the ground crew sees. Anxiously they look out for their friends. They needn't worry though, the operation has been a success. The Germans are nearly out of supplies. Now the ground forces can attack. Throughout May 1944, the Allied forces continued their attacks on the German positions, forcing them to retreat from Rome and moving them into more vulnerable positions further north. On June the 4th, 1944, Rome was liberated and the Allies moved in. As the ground troops moved north to the capital, they could see the evidence of battles fought from the skies and the help they had received from the Thunderbolts. Back at Alto Air Base, the pilots celebrated a hard-fought and well-deserved victory against oppression. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had served them well.